pieces of DNA which help it produce amino acids, nucleotides, all sorts of things, it's becoming totally dependent on the archaea. So there is that sort of a relationship that develops. So this bacteria now cannot survive outside the archaea cell. The archaea, on the other hand, is now dependent on bacteria because remember, energy production is via membranes. You need a membrane, as we discussed, for production of energy. And what is happening is that all these bacterial cells, I mean, a human cell has literally hundreds of thousands of mitochondria inside it. So so inside this cell, all these bacteria which have now become mitochondria, they have their own membranes, and these membranes are being used to produce energy, which is used by the bacteria inside, but also by the archaea. So a major source of energy for this large archaea, it now comes from these little bacteria which are inside it. So that's the codependence that evolved between these two. And eventually what has happened is that the bacteria that was engulfed has lost almost all of its DNA except for a few genes. And why it has still retained those few genes is an interesting question, and I can guide you to the appropriate reference. But there isn't enough time for us to go into that in this class.
Okay.
Does that make some sense at all?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool, excellent. Other questions, comments, anything?
So similar to when a genetic material can be lost, can it also be learned? So if an organism needs to learn to do something, how is it encoded into the new genetic material? How is it?
Okay, that's a slightly tricky question. It can happen in a few ways. So let's say let's say a bacteria cannot produce methionine, this amino acid, right? So, and it needs to, as you say, learn. Learning has a cognitive connotation, and bacteria have no cognition. So learning is technically not the best phrase to use for this purpose, but we'll go with that. So this bacterium has to learn how to make methionine. Uh, what do you think? How will this happen? Adishri, tell me. Don't worry about getting it wrong. It doesn't matter.
Sir, I think because there's no genetic material to do that and there's no
Hmm.
cellular machinery to do that, so
Yes.
it cannot happen in the reverse order manner.
Okay. But then how come everything has evolved?
I mean, that was my question.
So is your question that how did it happen the first time around?
Yeah, yeah.
So let's imagine, well, the first time around question is a difficult one, and we don't know because we have all these enzymes. Uh, Again, it's a longish. I mean, this could probably be a 15-minute rant uh, that I'm not sure I want to get into right now. Uh, let's let's not discuss the question of how it started first. Okay, how did the enzyme which can synthesize methionine evolve for the first time? Let's not talk about that, not because we want to avoid that question, but because I don't want to discuss that question at this juncture in the course. Let's wait a few weeks. Okay, again, can you please remind me? We will talk about something called fitness landscapes very soon, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks. Can you please remind me this question then? Okay.
Yes, sir, sure.
But if we leave aside, I don't want to completely ignore this question at this point. So what we have done is we have kept this question of how did it arise the first time on hold right now. But let's take the other case where I know that I can't produce methionine, but there are other organisms in the surroundings which can produce methionine, right? So what can happen and what happens a lot is something called horizontal gene transfer. That organisms are always exchanging genes with each other. So let me give you an example. That we have a soil bacteria called Bacillus subtilis. Okay, uh, it's any garden soil on campus or anywhere for that matter. You will find Bacillus subtilis there. It's a soil organism. This organism has a habit, and soil has a lot of DNA: plant DNA, animal DNA, bacterial DNA, tons of DNA. Bacillus subtilis has this habit of picking up random pieces of DNA from its surroundings and taking that piece of DNA up and retaining it if that piece of DNA contains information that's useful for it. Okay. So if I, as an individual, don't know how to make methionine, but I find this piece of DNA which contains genes which encode for enzymes that do help make methionine, I'm simply going to retain that piece of DNA in myself and incorporate it in my genome. So in that sense, I have learned how to make methionine. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
There is another mechanism. Do you know who won the Nobel Prize last year for, I mean, last year, I mean 2019, or was it 18? Do you know what did Frances Arnold win the Nobel Prize for? She won the chemistry Nobel Prize 2 or 3 years back. Anybody? Okay. So again, this was 2 3 years back. Frances Arnold is at Caltech, and what she won the Nobel Prize for is a technique which has been used for a number of applications to produce to evolve enzymes which can carry reactions which are potentially useful from a commercial or a health perspective or something like this. Okay, so imagine this, that I want to find an enzyme which catalyzes a reaction whose product is very important for some cure. Okay, but the problem is there is no good enzyme uh, that can carry out that reaction. Now enzymes are very specific, but I can also find an enzyme which has some other function, but it has the slightest bit of activity towards the reaction that I want to carry out. Okay, if I can locate such an enzyme, then what we can do is what if we can locate such an enzyme, then what we can do is we can tweak the sequence of this enzyme that we have found, which has minimal activity towards the reaction that we want to carry, and then evolve it so that its activity towards the reaction that we want to carry out is increased as we go along. So there are ways by which, so in that process, we have evolved an enzyme that was catalyzing a reaction extremely poorly to begin with, but now we have a very high specificity towards a particular reaction that we carry out. And that reaction could be making methionine also. So in that sense, we have again learned how to make methionine in a cell. But let's wait for this question before we get into the molecular details. I think we can answer this question much better then. Other questions?
Yes, sir. So from the last class, we defined fitness for sexually reproducing organisms as a number of offspring one individual can produce, right?
Yes, yes.
So on continuing on that thought, doesn't the quality of offspring depend means count into the fitness of the individual? For example, if there are rapidly reproducing animals, for example rats, they produce large number of uh, animal offsprings in a single generation, and it's very fast producing as well, right?
Yes,
So, but most of these offsprings also die very soon.
yes.
So, doesn't that also account for the fitness of the rat?
So, how many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you do not know what is recombination? Okay. 4 or 5 people. Okay. Okay, fine. Um, so let's think about it like this, that when we have a bacterium that divides, okay, so bacterium has a certain piece of DNA sequence, and when it replicates, uh, what do you think is going to be the DNA sequence of the progeny? Yes.
Uh, it will be for a bacteria, right? So it
Or
will be
bacteria, yes.
identical, almost
Right.
identical.
Almost identical unless a error happened during the replication process,
Right.
which is pretty rare. The replication process is fairly robust. Okay,
Yeah.
so it will be identical as the parent. So whatever was the fitness of the parent was inherited by the progeny,
Right.
right? Fine. So but but what do you think is the relationship between your sequence and your parent's sequence?
So there are two strands in the DNA, and one is from the mother and father. So
Correct.
each will have some error, and that constitutes to my DNA as well.
Each will have some error.
Yeah, very small, but there will be error, right?
Yeah,
As in,
so
half of my strand is from my mother, and half is from my father.
correct. So the one strand that you have, so we are talking about one pair. We have 23 such pairs, right? And these are called chromosomes.
Right.
We're talking about one such pair. You've inherited one of the strands from your father and one from your mother. But the one that you inherited from your father, which one is it? He had two, right?
Yeah.
So which one is it?
That depends on chance.
Yes and no. It does depend on chance, but when the choice is made regarding which of the two strands, it's not that you get one complete strand. Uh, Let me sketch this for you. Uh, Let me share the screen. All right. Uh, let's imagine you guys can see, right?
Yes, sir.
Let's imagine that this is all right. This is fine. Let's imagine that these are the two strands in your father's DNA. And now he obviously gives you one of the two, right? And this is for one of the chromosomes. So these are the two copies of, let's say, chromosome 1 that he's carrying. Similarly, there are 22 other pairs also. And the same thing happens for each of the chromosomes. So the question is that which one of the two did he give to you? And it is based on chance, but there is something else that happens before it's decided that which of the two chromosomes he's going to pass on to you. And it's not a complete, it's not either this strand or this strand. What gets packaged in a sperm or an egg is sort of a mishmash of the two. So in one of the sperms, the packaging that might happen might be something like this. Yes, can you summarize what happened?
Yeah. So part of the blue strand is taken, part of the red strand is taken, and it is being
Correct.
made into a combination, right?
Exactly. So some sort of a concoction has been made from the two chromosome ones that he was carrying. Okay. And do you have siblings?
Yeah.
You have sibling. So your sibling the concoction of chromosome 1 that you have from your father is different from the one that your sibling has, unless you are identical twins.
Right.
Okay, so and of course the same happens with your mother as well. She has two sets of a pair of chromosome 1, and the one that she passed you is also a concoction of these chromosomes, that the two copies that she has. Okay,
Yeah.
the point being that when we are talking of sexually reproducing animal organisms, then if I have a certain fitness, my DNA sequence has a certain fitness, right? And
Yeah.
now the offspring that I'm going to be so let's imagine that the DNA sequence that I have is absolutely fantastic in every respect. I'm going to leave 100 offsprings behind, right? But the point is that whenever I mate with someone and I produce an offspring, I'm not passing on the exact same genotype that made me so great in terms of producing offsprings was concerned, right? My
Yeah.
offsprings are not going to have the same fitness as me, because half of the DNA of the offspring doesn't even come from me; it comes from someone else, right? And the half that I am giving is also, we don't know whether I passed on the good bits or the bad bits,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So again, it becomes a question of statistics. While it's statistically likely, not even sure, while it's statistically likely that I pass, that my progeny will have a greater fitness than somebody who wasn't as fit as me, there is no sort of certainty in saying that my progeny will definitely be fitter than someone else whose fitness was less than mine. Okay,
Yeah.
it depends on the combination that you pass on to the progeny. It depends on the environment in which this is happening, and that's actually an extremely complex problem to solve.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is eugenics? All of you? Anybody?
Is it that a certain kind of uh, trait population is more enhanced or superior than another kind? Is the thought that this is true?
Yes, yes, yes. So this was an idea that I guess we are running late. So we encountered the person who coined the term eugenics at the end of the class today. Perhaps it's going to spill to the next week now. Uh, Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin. And the idea was that if we place emphasis on genetics, not if these the proponents of this idea uh, would say that genetics is the sole deciding factor for traits like intelligence, height, weight, whatever, and hence we can create conditions where we are producing quote unquote smarter, fitter human beings. And hence, in order to be able to do this, mating should be controlled in populations in a certain fashion, right? And obviously, the worst possible manifestation of this was the Nazi Germany, but Scandinavia, US, around the turn from 19th to 20th century, also saw terrible, to a lesser extent, uh, official policy makings which controlled uh, mating behavior of many races from across the world. The question, the the the, arg- the arguments for why eugenics is wrong is very interesting, and it's something that I would like to get into a little bit later in the course. Maybe towards the end of the course, we will talk about this thing. So yes, to answer your question, it's not guaranteed that my offsprings will be fitter than. I'm sorry. that my offsprings will be as fit as me. And this is because of number of reasons. One, half of their DNA doesn't come from me. Second, the half that I contribute, I don't know whether I'm contributing the good bit or the bad bit to them, right? I might also have some bad bits. Genes and proteins are always working while talking to each other, right? It's not as if that every protein in the cell is working independently. These are large networks which come together to produce an organism such as you and me. So when we have to think of genes, we have to think of them as combinations. That is this combination of genes good or is this combination of genes bad? So it might turn out that I might be very fit, but I pass on a combination of genes that's terrible to one of my offsprings. And the third bit is that the relationship between the environment and the genes is an extremely complex one. When I was growing up or when I was procreating, I might have been in an environment which was very conducive to the set of genes that I was carrying, but that need not necessarily be true of my offsprings. So a lot of things go into it, and the net result is, so that's one of the conundrums about sexual reproduction actually, that suppose, I am also a product of sexual reproduction, and suppose my parents mated and they made this just quote unquote wonderful combination of genes that came together because of my parents mating, and the combination that I have is just wonderful. Couldn't get better. Let's say that, right? So now, if natural selection, because you've created this wonderful packet of genes in one individual, you would like to keep it as it is and not break that combination up. But the nature of sexual reproduction is that combination has to be broken up as you go from one generation to another. And that's one of the conundrums about evolution of sexual reproduction, that it breaks up these combinations of genes, which when they're together are actually extremely fit. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, comments? All right, cool. So I wanted to just end the last bit. So Darwin in chapter 4 mentions a few things, and I'm not going to go into the others, but he talks about these hermaphrodites, and he says that close inbreeding, and the closest inbreeding that you get is a hermaphrodite, which basically mates with itself to produce an offspring. If you have someone who's carrying both the sexual and the reproductive organs of both the sexes, then one can mate with itself and produce an offspring. And there are many worms which are examples of hermaphrodites. The most commonly used is called C. elegans. But Darwin says that close inbreeding has been known to diminish fertility, and crossbreeding between distant individuals who are not related increases vigor. And there is, as Darwin says, quote, a general law of nature that no organic being self-fertilizes itself for an eternity of generations. Why could this be so?
Perhaps the environment is changing, and as the same genes are being followed up, they won't be suitable for the future environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other ideas?
So, mine is a genetic perspective. So inbreeding would result in excessive recessive traits being, you'll have both alleles as recessive traits sometimes, and that could very well lead to the worst possible scenarios. They're recessive for a reason, so they can lead into the whole organism's death, the population's death. So
Right.
it's only when you don't have certain recessive traits that you can carry forward your species. So I think that's the reason.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's imagine that my grandfather was carrying a copy of a gene of course, you have two copies of a gene because you acquire one copy from your father, one copy from your mother. Let's say my grandfather had a copy of a gene which sort of made hemoglobin non-functional, but he had the other copy which was completely fine, and hence, that hemoglobin, it would keep him functional. And let's look at this through an illustration of the most famous case of this, which is this case of a Spanish ruling family, so the Habsburg family. And what happened was that this is sort of a very well characterized case because the ancestry records are pretty good for this family. And in the beginning of 18th century, the last heir to the throne couldn't produce an offspring, and the dynasty sort of ended. And this is the family tree, and the last king was King Charles II. Died in 1700, was almost 40, couldn't reproduce, and the family tried everything possible for him to mate with someone and produce an heir. Couldn't. Is there something peculiar? And this is a family tree. So this particular, the names are not important. The picture's too small, but it doesn't matter. This particular individual, for instance, this is the mother, this is the father, or I don't know which one is male, which one is female, but these are the two parents. Similarly, for everyone, this individual, these are the two parents, and so on and so forth. And finally, we get to Charles II, and after that, there is no one. The family ended. Do you notice something peculiar about this family tree?
It's shrinking after the middle. So that.
What do you mean shrinking?
So people who are close relatives are getting married.
Correct. Correct. Others? Anything else?
The number of offspring is also limited.
Yeah, sure. Okay, but maybe that is because only the way to Charles II is being shown. Maybe the women offsprings are not being shown because we want to come down to Charles II. That's why, right? Anything else? So one extremely interesting thing is that these are called pedigree trees, okay, or family trees. The one very interesting thing in this particular tree is that in a family tree, you should never see cycles. You should never see a loop being completed. If a loop is being completed, that means there was inbreeding. That means relatives were mating with each other. And if you see this particular one, basically you only have inbreeding in this family, maybe except for this person who has come from another tree, another family. Everybody, and here is another one. Everybody else is just inbreeding from within the family. And again, that's an interesting question that we'll come back to some other point. But it's really curious that this effect is so strong that Darwin saw it in the middle of the 19th century. And the general law of nature does seem to hold. I must also mention that when I say that there is a lot of inbreeding, I'm saying that without any moral commentary on mating within a family. I'm saying it purely from the perspective of this not being a very smart biological strategy of propagating a family or a dynasty in this case. Okay, all right. All right, so let's move ahead. So we're talking selection, okay? And today what we'll do is I want to discuss how selection can change behavior in different ways of a phenotype, and then also discuss some of the critiques of natural selection in the years immediately after publication of Origin of Species. So let's imagine one of the ways selection can operate is, let's imagine this is the distribution of a trait, which could be height, which could be the size of the beak as we saw, and this is the frequency distribution. And as time progresses, maybe this beak size distribution goes from here to here. The mean beak size was this, the mean beak size increased to a certain size. And whenever you have a trait change in this particular direction, that is called as directional selection. Of course, it could be the other way too. This could be the starting distribution and you end up here. That's also directional selection. But anytime a distribution as a whole moves in a particular direction, that form of selection is called directional selection. Beaks is one example whose data we saw last time around. Other forms of selection can do other things also. Imagine that the bird population was like this. Now, what happened is that the food availability changed in a fashion such that the phenotype is the beak size. The food availability changed in a fashion such that either you needed very long beaks so you can reach into the flowers and get nectar from there, or you needed very short and stout beaks such that you could crack open the nuts and get access to them. Intermediate, you could neither get access to food via flowers nor could you crack open the nuts because your beak was just too fragile to be able to do that. In that case, starting with this original distribution, selection either favors that you have very long, slender beaks or that you have very short, stout beaks. And what will happen then is that the population might split into two. What started as a homogeneous population of a normal distribution split into two different distributions around two different means. This form of a selection is called divergent selection. Okay. Does that make sense? The other kind is that if the environment was such that this was the starting distribution, and for some reason the mean remains the same, but now the environment is such that lesser deviations around the mean are being tolerated. You have to be really close to the mean for you to be able to survive in this particular environment. And as a result, the distribution changes to a more narrower distribution around the same mean. And this type of a selection is called purifying selection. That a certain degree of variance was allowed around the mean, but as an environmental shift takes place, that amount of variance is no longer being tolerated, and you need a much tighter distribution. You need a value of the phenotype much closer to the mean to be able to survive in the environment. This form is called purifying selection. We'll see examples of these three types of selection throughout the course. But I do want you to just keep it in mind that selection could be directional in either direction. It could be divergent. This is also called disruptive selection, that you disrupted a mean and you had two different distributions come up. And lastly, you could have purifying selection, which doesn't really do anything. It sort of narrows the phenotype around the existing mean in that environment. All right, this is pretty straightforward. All right, so tell me, what do you think are the issues with theory of natural selection? And I almost prefer it that you didn't know biology, because if you are a biology student, then you already know the issues with natural selection. But what do you think are some of the problems which either are unexplained or are uncomfortable to swallow? Anything?
One thing I noticed was he mentions that the variation in one species would not advantage another species, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but we see examples of symbiotic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So he might not be aware of it, but he
Yeah.
failed to answer that.
Yeah. In his defense, what he says is that if if natural selection can produce something, can produce a phenotype in species A, which 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 is solely for the benefit of species B, right? That's a problem. He says then what I'm saying falls flat. That natural selection will never evolve a trait which is natural selection will never evolve a trait in species A which is for the exclusive benefit of species B. There has to be something in it for me, for natural selection to have evolved that trait. And and the example that you cite of all the symbiotic relationships that exist in the population, uh, that exist in ecology, actually that association is very direct, because if I am symbiotic relationship by definition means that I help you, you help me, right? So it is in my interest for you to get better, for you to do better, because if I can be of aid to your growth, you will do better. And because of the nature of association that we have between the two of us, uh, you doing better would mean that you sort of are able to support me to a greater extent, and then that helps me. So it's a positive feedback loop that's established between these two species. So it's not something that has evolved for the exclusive benefit of the partnering species. In a symbiotic relationship, of course, I reap the benefit of that feedback loop also. In a very recent paper published, what these guys, since we were talking amino acids and auxotrophy, what these guys did was they grew up a pair of bacteria, different species, and what was happening was that this one couldn't produce amino acid B, okay, but it could produce A, and this one couldn't produce A, but it could produce B, and they grew them together, and they grew them together in an environment where neither A nor B was present. What would happen?
They will naturally depend on each other.
Correct. So there is a natural
They call-
dependence now, right? This one can't make A, this one can't make B. So what that means is, in order for these guys to grow, they have to feed each other these amino acids,
Correct.
right? So one is without any evolution taking place, there is a metabolic codependence on these guys, between these guys on each other. Now, that for that no evolution needs to take place. That's the way these guys are, right? But when you evolve these two guys together in lab, what happened very rapidly was that this guy who couldn't produce A but could produce B suddenly increased its production capability of B and its export capability of B. Okay. And this guy who could produce A but not B increased the production capability of A and the amount of A that it was releasing into the environment, right? And now, in one sense, if you see that this is happening only for the purpose of the other one, but this relationship is established on the fact that if you do help the other one, and if the other one does start growing better than now, then you reap greater benefits from that association and you grow faster too. So that's a direct example where evolution took you in a direction where you were doing something to help a participating species in an ecological relationship that you had, but only because it did help you do better as well. Otherwise, there is nothing in it for me. Okay.
Yeah.
But like what he mentions is that directly he says that it's for the good of another species, right? So that is a little contradictory, I think.
That is a little contradictory, but what's an example of that? Yes. Is there an example you have in mind?
Where one species is producing which is directly for the benefit of the other.
Well, not directly, but solely for the benefit of the
Solely.
other.
Okay. No, then I don't think that is the
Well,
case.
yeah. I mean, think about it. If you can come up with an example, we can study it and see if that's indeed true.
Okay.
In fact, in fact, evolution of altruism is an extremely the study of evolution of altruism, which is helping others without seeking anything back in return, is a really curious study, and in 60s and 70s there were some really interesting papers published on this area. Fine. Okay, other problems with chapter 4.
The timeline he suggested would always be very, very large. Evolution could not happen rapidly. But as we've seen and discussed previously as well, that it does happen rapidly in some cases.
Correct. Absolutely. So Darwin says that in an ecological setting, evolution is going to take an extremely long time, and he's adamant. He's very adamant throughout Origin of Species and the later books he published that evolution will take place very, very slowly. Nature will act on just the minutest differences that selection can act on minutest differences that exist in a population among individuals. And it will take an inordinately long time for these differences to accumulate and show up as a large difference, to the extent that within a human life, that it's going to be very hard for us to follow these differences. Correct. But as you said, that we now know of examples where evolution happens very rapidly, and it's definitely something that we see within a human life. Interestingly, I mentioned that we are going to discuss problems with Darwin's idea in the context of one, what Darwin wrote, and second, what this electrical engineer Fleming Jenkins wrote in an essay as a review of Origin of Species. Jenkins' problem, Darwin says that it's going to take time it takes a very long time for evolution to take place and something to come up. Jenkins writes in his essay that it seems that time alone is going to do something. Like, he says that Darwin is sort of bypassing the real question of how does change come about by just relegating the issue of how change came about to just time. He's sort of sidestepping the main issue of explaining how or why does change come about, because he just says, oh, give it time, and as if time will do something and changes will come about. And he says he doesn't talk about the details of how this could happen, and he says that the explanation that giving it millions of years to bring about change is extremely unsatisfactory and time won't do it. So yeah, but you're right in the sense that Darwin did say that's one thing that I think there is unanimous consensus that Darwin was wrong about evolution, that it takes really, really long time. You can have very rapid evolution too. Other issues, questions?
When you stated the concept about the whole idea about humans helping each other, right? Altruism.
I didn't say humans, but could be anything. Yeah.
Okay, it could be anything. Is that really something that's extraordinary? Because it feels as though altruism is only going to help the species as a whole to develop even further. So, in that sense, we're talking about the survival of a species.
Yeah.
Then in that case, altruism would definitely be a selection process, right? So that could help species become better at living together in a societal environment, which can only be beneficial to them, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of this sort of work started with sort of around the time when game theory was being used for evolution, and when you're looking at from that perspective, the issue becomes that, and I'm going to make it extremely simplistic and not reality at all. Okay, so this is a dumbed down version of who knows how it plays out. Let's imagine that there is a gene for altruism. Okay, and Anirudh, stop me at any time if I stop making sense. Let's imagine there is a gene for altruism, and you have a population, and you have one individual which acquires this gene for altruism. Okay, what's going to happen?
Since it is not thinking as much about its own survival, it will gradually go extinct.
Okay, Anirudh, what do you think?
No, I don't think that's the case, because I think those are two independent ideas.
Which
Helping
two?
helping self and helping a third person. I don't think that has to be correlated. Like, if you help others, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will diminish your survival in any way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, at the very least, it's not simple. I don't know if they're dependent or independent, but the argument would be that since you are helping others now, it comes at some cost to your own fitness also, in some complicated way which we don't know about. But the analysis that this would go in, the direction that it would go in, is that if something like this comes up and we have one individual which is carrying this gene for altruism, is that gene going to spread in the population, or is selection going to eliminate that gene? And what are the precise conditions under which you have this gene spread in the population? If you can successfully demonstrate that, that's, I think, a job well done. Then you're making a case for evolution of something. So that's the context in which altruism has been also looked at. I mean, a simple scenario of this would be that you have a bacterial population growing in a tube where everybody is making resource for itself, and you have you add one individual to this population which is sort of making resource for itself, but also secreting, let's say, 10% of the resource to be used by everyone in the community, right? Without reaping any benefit in return. What's going to happen to this mutant that is carrying this altruism gene? Anybody?
It's not going to survive, in the sense that
In this context, it's not going to survive, right? So a lot of there is an inordinate amount of work which has gone on to explain evolution of cooperation or altruism. I mean, altruism is something different and more difficult. I have shared. So maybe let's have this conversation on Wednesday if we get time. I wrote a little article in a science communication website about one of the guys that did some work on this. It's not a technical thing. It's a science communication short article. Read it, and maybe we can discuss that if there is another interest. But that's the idea. I mean, this goes into many tangents, and I do want to stick to sort of what we have in mind regarding the course. Other ideas? Other problems?
Sir, in that case, it doesn't entirely explain what humans do, right? Because humans can choose to mate, they can choose to be benevolent, they can choose to be a lot of things, but then this natural selection does not really explain that.
In a pure mechanistic sense, no. Sure, yeah, sure, I agree. But I'm not clear in what particular context you are saying this.
Like, for example, even if a person is he has the best genes, he can choose to not mate and pass them on.
what is best gene.
No, like you mentioned, like possibly the best combination of genes from the parents.
But we are defining best in the context of more offsprings,
Oh, like that best. Okay, okay.
right? So I mean, I'm not suggesting, I didn't mean best in terms of, looking good, or I don't know, intellect or money or fame or whatever. I didn't mean best in any kind of those things. The only thing that nature will care about is how many offsprings I leave behind, right?
So it still doesn't account for the ability of man to like make a choice.
Yeah, sure, sure. No, it doesn't. But I don't. So let me ask you this, and I did this course a couple of years back, and this was one of the problems, not problems, but one of the essays that I asked the participating students to write. What do you think are the selection forces acting on humans? Like the birds, for instance, that we saw that data that the beak size has decreased. That's because there hasn't been much rain on Daphne Major, the island, and the food sources have shifted from more softer seeds to harder nuts, and that has resulted in a consequent decrease in the beak size. That's a selection force acting towards decrease of beak size. But what do you think are the selection force acting on humans today?
So as we see different races, I think they have been produced because of sexual selection in the region that they were living in. So that can be one force.
Okay, sure.
The climate acting on the people living in the area.
Living in the what?
Living in the area, like in colder countries, people have whiter complexion. In hotter countries, people have darker complexion.
Okay, yes. No, I mean modern societies. These are historical. These things that you mention are sort of historically been there because before modern societies came into being.
So resource constraint is
I'm trying to capture the question that Pavitra answered, that it's no longer about just survival. Our minds and thought process and social constructs have become so complex that I myself am not clear what are the selection forces that are acting on human beings. Does that capture the spirit of what you were trying to say, Pavitra?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Like capitalism.
Yeah, I think greed could be a selection force acting on human beings. Sure, I can buy that. Yeah. Sure. I'm equating capitalism with greed. Anybody has a problem with that? All right, sure. We need to move. Go ahead, Yash. Last comment, then we'll move.
yeah. So we are not sure what the selection force is, but isn't a resource constraint itself a significant selection force?
Agreed,
I mean,
agreed. But
human
the point is, sure, no, I agree. But resource constraints with respect to what? I mean,
sure.
it's complex. It's complex, and it's really tricky. Resource constraint would mean that. So I mean, economically, I'm not constrained by resources. I think I'm doing pretty well, but I don't have any offspring, right? But think of a resource. I mean, ours is again economically a very stratified society. So a family might be extremely constrained in resources, doing much worse economically than what I am doing, but still that couple could have 3 children, for instance, right? So and again, no moral judgments. I'm just purely speaking biology. So in that sense, that resource constraints compared to me does does place that family in a disadvantage with respect to access to health, nutrition, education, sanitation, whatever. But in terms of the simple biological act of producing offsprings, it doesn't. I am at a disadvantage, right?
Right.
So I don't know how to think about the selection forces acting on the complex human societies that we have structured today. I'm not sure. Yeah, go ahead, Anirudh.
Yeah, I had a question more related to Darwin's the natural selection chapter, and what's fuzzy to me is when he speaks about an isolated environment and a large environment like the Serengeti, for example,
Yeah.
where he suggests that the rate of natural selection in a particular direction reduces in the Serengeti as compared to an isolated position. And I don't quite understand how that.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it seems confusing because the way he describes it is because there is no competition in the isolated system, it's always going to go into the direction of how the environment is, and it's
Correct.
there is a particular direction to natural selection. While in the Serengeti, there are different regions, and
Yeah.
there are isolated pockets, and
Yeah.
even though, like, very sometimes or maybe a little more often, the same species but living in different regions might come together and crossbreed, and that would decrease natural selection as a whole, and it would kind of even out the genetic profile. I'm not sure what that term would be. So my question is, like, is that necessarily true? Because I don't understand that. I mean, I understand the isolated system; it makes sense,
Yeah.
but the Serengeti's idea is very fuzzy in my head.
Yeah. No, I understand that confusion. I think by and large, it is true. If you have, so I think he's talking about that more in terms of one of the perspective that he's talking about that is more from the perspective of diversification of life that takes place. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So essentially the idea is that an isolated place, presumably small, is not going to have a lot of resources for species to thrive on. It's going to be unidirection. If there is only one food available that you can, then you will only grow better. Then you will only grow to be better at utilizing that food source. Compare that with an environment where there are 10 different resources, and then what you could have is specialization of utilizing those resources for each of those resources. And one of the terms that he uses in chapter 4 is, he says that correlated laws of growth. Does anybody remember that? Unknown correlations of growth. And by that, what he means is that there are these unknown correlations, that unknown because we don't know them, that if a species grows to become better at one particular thing, then automatically, because of some unknown law of correlation, you become worse at something else. Not because you selected to be worse at that particular trait, but because you wanted to be better, wanted is in quotes, because you were selecting to be better at this particular phenotype, you automatically became worse in some other sense. An example of this could be that horse breeders breed horses for two particular purposes. One is you want your horse to be the swiftest when it comes to running. So in that sense, you're not looking for huge horses, you're looking for lean horses. The other purpose is that you are looking for horses which can carry a lot of weight, and then you're looking for extremely strong, not as fast horses. So if you're going for high speed, you're immediately paying only in terms of this correlation. If you're going for faster horses, you are immediately going for lower weight horses. So So there is a correlation between top speed and the weight of the horse. Similarly, if you have an extremely complex environment, then what's going to happen is that because of the abundance of resources that are present in that environment and the existence of possible trade-offs, that I can't be the best at utilizing all those resources. I would have to choose one particular resource and grow to be the best at it if I have to survive in that environment. And that if that holds for every resource in that environment, then I'm going to have 10 different species, each of which specializes at utilizing one of the 10 resources that are available in the environment. And these are the little pockets of isolation that have evolved. And these pockets need not even be geographical pockets. In a famous example, there were flies. This was an experiment that was done in North America a few decades back. You had hawthorns. This fruit called hawthorns. Does anybody know what is it? So these, you guys can see, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you had flies which were surviving on hawthorns. And then apple was introduced to North America. And when you had apple, and it was noticed in one of the cases that when apples and hawthorns were growing in the same park, basically, or same field, then what happened was that this fly population split into two. And this split into two such that one specialized on utilizing the hawthorns and one specialized on utilizing apples, to the extent that these two fly populations, which originated from a common ancestor, they couldn't even mate with each other. The hybrids were just not viable. So that's an example of where, when the resource availability changed from 1 to 2, you had immediate specialization. Immediate in biological sense took a few years, I think. You had immediate specialization and eventually resulting in speciation of this original population, which all belong to one particular species. So at least to my mind, in that context, what he's saying makes sense. Does that help at all?
Yeah. No, I was thinking about something like the jack of all trade, master of none kind of concept, but that's not true. You kind of explained that they are getting better at certain things. It's just not directional. So
Yeah, so it depends on, that's a curious example. So it depends on what is the hybrid doing. That if I were to have a fly population starting from a common pool, you evolve a fly population on one carbon source, you evolve a fly population on carbon source B, you let them go for a few generations, right? Not so long that they would become completely different species and not mating and not mate with each other at all, but only for a few generations, such that evolution towards specialization on these carbon resources has started, but has not gone so far along that mating would stop between them. And then what you do is, midway through, you take one fly from one source, other fly from another source, you mate them, produce an offspring, and now you have a hybrid. Invariably, what's found is that this hybrid would not do so well in either of it. This hybrid would not be able to outcompete either of the two pools which have grown by exclusive specialization on one carbon source or the other.
That's also confusing because another phrase of Darwin is that it is better to stop inbreeding than so it's better to allow two more distant variations to
Correct.
breed together to produce a better offspring, and then that confuses me even more.
I agree. There is a lot of confusion with that. So I agree. And I don't think that's been resolved actually. So there is something that he uses. So he uses what is called hybrid vigor to explain what you're saying. And at the same time, so if you look at the course outline, we will not, I guess we will talk about both these aspects, and these are different aspects. What mating with a distant offspring, not a distant, I'm sorry. What mating with a distant individual not related to you would mean is that it would mask the recessive alleles that you are carrying, and the offspring wouldn't have those genetic problems that you might have if you mated with a close relative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's the context in which he's saying that we should mate with someone who's not genetically very close to us, right? The other thing of these specialists doing better than generalists. So again, each of these is a huge area with tons of work on being done on this. And evolution of generalists versus evolution of specialists is another such area. Large amounts of work. We address some of these aspects in our lab too. The evolution of generalists versus specialists is a different debate altogether. And what it eventually comes down to is that if I am evolving to be a specialist in particular environment A, what's going to happen is that I, as an individual, most of this work is done with single-celled organisms, so simple systems. So if I'm evolving to do better in an environment A, then what's going to happen is that I am going to channel the allotment of my cellular resources in such a way which is optimized towards allowing me the fastest growing rate in this environment A. If I were to evolve myself in environment B, the resource allocation, and by resource allocation I mean, how much ribosomes go to everything, how is the genetic regulation going to be rewired, what gene gets turned on to what degree at what particular time, all these things. This is what I mean by resource allocation. If I were to evolve myself in environment B, the resource allocation program would be different from what the resource allocation program was in environment A. And now when I bring these two together, then there is going to be a conflict between those two resource allocation programs, and that's not going to, that hybrid individual is not going to do as well as compared to either of the two specialists when I compete this hybrid with either A or B environment. The hybrid vigor issue that he's talking about, that's a scenario where there is no specialization that has taken place in the population. When I marry someone, when I mate with someone who's not close to me, then the resource allocation problems of us as human beings is sort of the same, but it's just that I want the recessives in my genome to be masked by what the other person is going to be contributing towards the offspring we produce. And it's a slightly different argument compared to the specialist versus generalist phenomena. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
So in the event that carbon source A would be depleted, then I would think that the hybrid would survive over the more specialists.
Sure.
So
sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So again, depends on what precise environment are we doing this in, right? If we are competing A versus the hybrid in environment B, then presumably the hybrid should do better than the A specialist.
Yeah.
All right, let me quickly go through a couple of things that I also wanted to mention. Some of the issues we've already talked about. The biggest issue was that there was no mechanism. Darwin doesn't say anything at all about where is this variation coming from, how is it being passed from one generation to another. What he did notice was that blending inheritance operates. And by blending inheritance is that if we have a height distribution in a population, if this individual A mates with individual B, then the offspring is somewhere in the middle. This is the offspring side. Now, if that is the case, and if mating is completely random, now you might say mating is not random in human populations, but he's not talking of human population. He's talking about all sorts of populations in the wild. So if mating is completely random, then the distribution of the trait in the next generation will have the same mean, but the variance will get reduced to this deviation will be half of that of the original distribution, and that's just a simple statistical law. We can do the proof if you guys want. Mean remains the same. This posed a problem to Darwin. He still doesn't, there is no basis of mechanism here. He's only talking of an empirical observation that if random mating takes place, this should happen. Now he's very troubled by this because this poses additional problems. Because if this keeps on, the first problem that he faces is that if this keeps on propagating, then all variance will be lost in a few generations. Evolution will grind to a halt, which is not true. At the same time, he knows, he's seen it with his eyes, that if in one generation a trait shows a distribution with a certain variance, in the next generation the variance invariably stays more or less the same. But he's also seen blending, so he knows blending is operating. He knows that variance still remains, so he has to come up with a mechanism which explains the variance remaining the same in face of blending reducing the variance to half. And that is a mechanism that he doesn't have, and that he considers to be the biggest weakness that this theory has.
Sir, in one of the places, like he was mentioning that the effects of intercrossing to be balanced by natural selection in nature. Was this what he was referring to?
Let me come back to what he proposed in just a minute. Okay, so his answer was completely wrong. Let me come to that in a second. So that's the problem, because he knows from empirical evidence that variance stays more or less the same as we go through generations. So what he's forced to propose is that he knows that blending would so this is the original distribution. If blending was the only force that was operating, distribution would get changed to this. But he knows that the distribution remains more or less the same. So after blending, going from one generation to another, this distribution changes to this distribution, but this is not what he sees. What he sees is this. So he says that after blending, there must be an additional source of variance that gets added, and he doesn't know what to do with it. That's one of the biggest problems that he faces. The other problem he faces, and all of this is in chapter 6, where he says the challenges with the theory that I'm proposing. Imperfection of the fossil record. And this is a problem that bothers him, but he has a defense against it. What he's repeatedly emphasizing was that natural selection proceeds extremely slowly, acting on excruciatingly small differences between individuals. But then he says, when I look at the fossil records, I see jumps. I don't see continuous changes in a physical trait of a species that has evolved. Fossil records will show me something with a bone length of 1 feet, but in the next fossil record will be 3 feet. I don't have all the intermediates. And that he puts down to, he says the fossil record is imperfect. Not everything's been preserved, and whatever has been preserved hasn't been found out yet. So to that extent, he's not that uncomfortable with this particular critique of the work. Fleming-Jenkins had a couple of issues. Time bit we already discussed. Jenkins' other argument is that Darwin does nothing to explain how do novelties come into being. What Darwin is explaining is that how does something get better? he makes no contribution towards how do newer features come up in a population. The other issue that Jenkins has, he says that Darwin says that natural selection will keep on acting, and go on and on for a very long time. But he says that's not true at all. And what Jenkins writes in his essay is something called a sphere of, I wrote influence, but sphere of variation. And he says that consider this as a trait, and every trait, he says, has a certain boundary beyond which you cannot go. And the example that he gives is of race horses. He says breeders have been trying for centuries to get horses to run faster. He says, but we know from all this experience that you cannot get a horse to run faster than a certain limit. And this limit that, as Jenkins says, nature has placed upon a certain phenotype is the sphere of variation that you can play with. This is the boundary that has been set in nature. And by breeding and these controlled experiments that breeders do with playing with their intuition, you can tune the height or any other trait within this boundary. You cannot go outside of it. So evolution has limits which Darwin doesn't acknowledge, and Darwin does not do anything to explain how novelties come into being. This leads us to a debate that we'll talk about last time. But I want you guys to comment on this. The biggest debate that took place post publication of Origin of Species was what type of variation is responsible for evolutionary change. And the two warring camps, because these were extremely bitter, many times personal battles between the major players, had different thoughts. On the one side was the camp which said that selection acts on small differences acting on a population with a continuous distribution of any trait. And gradually this entire distribution will move towards the right or left depending on how selection might be acting. And this entire population will move towards left or right as time progresses. So these guys said that small continuous change that exists in a population, when acted upon by natural selection for a long time, brings about evolutionary change. So if I'm interested in studying evolution, this is the sort of a change that I should be focusing on in a population, because this is responsible for evolution given long enough time. These guys were called biometricians. Darwin, if we now think of him, he was a biometrician because he was convinced that it's these small changes that exist in a population which are responsible for evolution. These wars that took place between the biometricians and the other camp were, on the biometrician side, the main guys were Weldon and a statistician named Pearson. The Pearson coefficient and everything statistics that you do was developed by him in relation with solving this particular puzzle. On the other hand, were people who were not biometricians. I will not tell you their name now for a reason that we'll get to next time. These guys said that as far as evolution is concerned, this change is irrelevant. This variation that exists in a population is irrelevant because blending is going to take care of it. These guys can mate all they want, but blending will make sure that this change is completely irrelevant as far as evolution is concerned. For evolution to take place, we need a discontinuous variant which arises sporadically in a population and is not susceptible to blending. Because if this guy arose and if this guy was susceptible to blending, then this would again merge with this population because there are so many of them. The first time this individual mates with one of these individuals, its phenotype is going to come here and there and so on and so forth. Jenkins writes about this also. So he says that this camp says that evolution, for evolutionary change, the responsible variation is a discontinuous variant which arises sporadically, all of a sudden, no continuous movement, and this sporadically arose variant should not be susceptible to blending. This is the change that brings about evolutionary. This is the change that brings about evolutionary change. Galton, Francis Galton, the eugenics coiner and the racist cousin of Darwin, wrote a chapter in his book where he compares this diagram with evolution of species, and he says that bringing about evolutionary change is like toppling this figure from the side EF to ED. He says, if I apply a small force, this figure is not going to topple. I need a force which is beyond a certain strength for me to be able to topple this figure from EF to ED. And he says the small force which is irrelevant, which is not going to topple this, is like this small changes that are occurring in the population. I need a large enough force, more than a critical, that depends on the dimensions, for me to bring about this stability change in this and an evolutionary change in a population. And that is this thought after Galton was primarily processed by William Bateson. These were the two camps. Unfortunately, I did want to seek your opinion on which change do you think is relevant for evolution in your mind. We've run out of time. Next time we will continue this debate. Remember, this debate is going on at the end of, in the last decade of the 19th century. So I think Galton's book was written in 1878. And then late 80s onwards, Pearson and Bateson and Weldon became fierce rivals and wrote extremely personal emails, not emails, letters to each other. What we will do for next time, I will share a copy of Mendel's paper, which was published in 1860s, but was not known to the English-speaking world till the year 1900. I will share a copy of that, which was translated by Bateson himself, who was in the second camp. And we will discuss this debate next time and how it got resolved in the context of discovery of Mendelian genetics. Okay, we've run out of time. Let's close our discussion. If you have any technical questions, please stay. I will answer. No, don't stay. We will do it next time. If you have any logistics type of questions, we can discuss now. Otherwise, let's close for today, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
Sir, you have uploaded the course outline. So
Yes.
in that there are readings. So are summaries due on every reading, or you will tell us?
Would you like to do summaries on everything?
I just thought I missed out a summary, so I'm asking.
No. So see, I did want to have summaries on everything, but then the issue was that one, there were too many people in the course, which the number has come down. So I'm happy with that. But I also don't want to, dump so much work on you that it robs any joy for you guys in the course. So what I thought was that I will keep picking readings from the course in between for summaries. I mean, of course, I think you should read them, but you can read them at your own pace, at whatever depth you like. I will pick and choose a few for which I would like to see summaries.
Okay, sir.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good.
So chapter 6 is up for summary.
नहीं बताऊंगा ना.
Okay.
All right. Okay. If there's nothing else, then I will see you guys on Wednesday. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.